Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and here I am at 28 Camden Grove in London, in the Kensington area. Behind me you can see the flat where James Joyce lived in 1934. You can see the blue plaque, and it was the first floor he lived on, 28B, flat B. So James Joyce is one of Ireland's most celebrated writers. He was born in Dublin in 1882, the same year as De Valera. Not that De Valera was even born in Ireland. Anyhow, Joyce is a modernist novelist. He did write some volumes of poems, penny each, for instance, and Etche Puer. Quite short poems, but everything he wrote was perfectly crafted. He didn't publish many novels: Finnegan's Wake, Ulysses, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He wrote one play, Exiles, which is scarcely ever performed. I read that one when I was 19, about Irish expatriates resident in Italy, because of course he spent a lot of time there. So Joyce was born into an upper middle class Catholic family, and up until that point almost every Irish writer in the English language had been a Protestant. Perhaps the only exception would be the poet Thomas Moore. So then Joyce, he went to Clongo's Wood School when he was half past 6, as he said at the time himself. The youngest child of the school, but he didn't take to the brutal discipline. He was someone of prodigious early talent. And he soon left there. He went to Belvedere School in Dublin, a number of other other Catholic schools. So he finished school at the age of 16, and he went up to University College Dublin. So Trinity was the premier university in Ireland, but the people who went there were almost exclusively Protestants. I'm not sure if you need your bishop's permission to go to Trinity in those days. You certainly did later, and that would almost never have been forthcoming, lest you be infected with Protestantism by the Church of Ireland, which was running it at the time. Anyhow, at the age of 17, he decided he wished to correspond with Henrik Ibsen, the renowned Norwegian playwright. So he taught himself Norwegian in order to correspond with him. He was already having work published in literary essays by this time. So he was reading modern languages, and he graduated from Trinity at the age of 20. Remember, very, very few people went to university in those days. He was the eldest of about a dozen children. His father, Stanislaus, was from Cork, and he had a younger brother, Stanislaus, as well. So James was the great white hope, and his father wanted him to be a barrister because he seemed to have the skill set for it, and you could make a very good living. It was a very respectable profession back then. But Stanislaus Joyce was a bit of a waster. He inherited quite a lot of money. He'd gone to University College Cork in the 1860s, and he dropped out of there when he was reading medicine. He was a music hall performer for some time. He was involved in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he wanted to Ireland to leave the UK, become a republic, and he felt that could only happen if a superpower was helping the IRB, and the most likely enemy of the United Kingdom was France. So he'd gone away to France to join the French Foreign Legion during the Franco-Prussian War, but his mother chased him and made him come back. But anyway, he was a bit of a fool, was Joyce's father, who had a well-paid job, went from that to a less well-paid to a less well-paid. So the family, they were downstarts. Their life got worse and worse and worse. But anyway, having graduated, James Joyce, he then moved to Paris. He decided he'd read medicine. Once he was a doctor, he would have a regular salary. He was able to support himself writing. So he was doing medicine for a while, but he dropped out of that. Later moved to Trieste, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but a mostly ethnically Italian city. So he'd met a young chambermaid called Nora Barnacle. She was from Galway, but working in Dublin, and they immediately struck up a relationship. And after only a few months, he suggested, well, why don't you move to Trieste with me? So she did. And she'd never been overseas, didn't speak a word of a foreign language. It was a quite courageous, perhaps a foolhardy decision. So they moved to Italy, and they lived together the rest of their lives. And they lived in sin, and in those days that was absolutely scandalous. They had a daughter and a son. He gave both of them Italian names, Giorgio and Lucia. And his daughter unfortunately suffered from mental ill health. So he was teaching the Berlitz school there. He was interned when the First World War broke out because, of course, being Irish, he was British. Eventually was released in 1916, allowed to go to Switzerland, a neutral country. Lived in Zurich there the same time as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Quite a small city. They almost certainly passed on the street at one point, and indeed Sigmund Freud was there at that stage. So the war ended, and later he moved to Paris, where he spent almost the whole of the rest of his life. He'd only visited Dublin a couple of times, especially when his mother was dying. So completely rejected Christianity, and people had a much more fervent faith in those days. And when his mother was dying, at her deathbed, she pleaded with him to say that he believed in Jesus, and he refused to do so. Minutes later, his mother died. I think that was very cruel to take such a stand on point of principle, not to give his mother some comfort in her last few minutes. Anyway, he wasn't exactly a nationalist. Didn't want to be part of the UK either. Talked about the British Empire as a brutish empire. He loathed the Catholic Church, which he felt pushed him around as well, oppressed him. So they were living in Paris most of the time. He'd been crafting his books from 1904, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is a scarcely disguised autobiography. And well, you may have seen my review on that one, which I think is absolutely outstanding. Is one of the finest works of literature, and is quite sparse. It's not overdone, but every word is pitch perfect, and he's not afraid to repeat himself, to use the same word a few times on the same page. Anyhow, he mastered a few other languages. Finnegan's Wake, some people think, is his masterpiece, but it's almost impenetrable because he dips in and out of other languages. I mean, is opacity talent? The idea is that you can't communicate. Is it just showing off too much? He bore his erudition heavily, and then he's got that sentence about 100 pages long without a single punctuation mark or capital letter. I mean, for goodness sake. It's meant to be dream language, it's stream of consciousness, which he largely invented. So the characterization, so forth, more important than the plot, or Ulysses, the reworking of that ancient Greek legend of the Odyssey as one day in the life of Leopold Bloom, a Jewish Dubliner, and there are many real places mentioned there, and say that somebody is a Cyclops in that, or there's sort of the clash in rocks, or the sirens, and all these hazards they have to go through. So Joyce's work was very much full of lavatorial humour and frank sexuality, so most publishers wouldn't touch it. He was rejected dozens of times. Finally got his work published. He was banned in the Republic of Ireland till the 60s, banned in the UK till 1934, and the United States for some time. One judge called Lennon refused to have it published. So on a map of Ireland, Joyce wrote "Hic sunt Lennones," as in here are Lennons, sort of judge he didn't like. But he came to London, lived here for a few months in 1931, but he was followed by journalists, which he disliked, and he and Nora Barnacle got married in Kensington Registry Office. I'm not quite sure whether they're supposed to get married after all those years. Then they moved back to Paris. He's there at the early part of the Second World War, but he had to go to Zurich for an eye operation, which went wrong because he was almost blind by that stage. So he died in Zurich. There were 2 Irish diplomats in Zurich at the time, but they didn't bother to attend his funeral. He was very much disapproved of in Ireland at the time. So he's laid to rest there in Zurich, very close to the zoo, where he used to like to hear the lions roar. I wish I had visited his grave. So that is James Joyce, who was not too fond of this place by the end, Camden Grove, calling it Camden Grave. This is the same street where Jean Sibelius had lived some, say, 27 years earlier. That's enough from me. Toodaloo.